Space Platform, Chapter 1. There wasn't anything underneath but clouds, and there wasn't anything overhead but sky. Joe Kenmore looked out the plane window, past the co-pilot's shoulder. He stared ahead to where the sky and the cloud banks joined. It was many miles away, and tried to picture the job before him. Back in the cargo space of the plane, there were 4 big crates. They contained the pilot gyros for the most important object then being built on Earth. And it wouldn't work properly without them. It was Joe's job to take that highly specialized, magnificently precise machinery to its destination, help to install it, and to see its checking after it was installed. He felt uneasy. Of course, the pilot and co-pilot, the only 2 other people on the transport plane, knew their stuff. Every imaginable precaution would be taken to make sure the critically essential device, like the pilot gyro assembly, would get safely to where it belonged. It was being treated as if it were a crate of eggs, instead of a massive metal, smooth and polished, and lapped to a precision practically unheard of. But just the same, Joe was worried. He'd seen the pilot gyro assembly made. He'd helped on it. He knew how many thousandths of an inch had been split in machining its bearings, and the breadth-weight balance of its moving parts. He'd have liked to be back in the cargo compartment with it, but only the pilot's cabin was pressurized, and the ship was at 18,000 feet, flying west by south. He tried to get his mind off that impulse by remembering that at 18,000 feet, a good half of the air on Earth was underneath him, and by hoping the other half would be an easy rise above when the gyros were finally in place and starting out for space. The gyros, of course, were now on their way to be installed on the artificial satellite, to be blasted up and set into an orbit around the Earth as the initial stage of that figurative stepladder by which men would be making their first attempt to reach the stars. Until that space platform had left the ground, the gyros were Joe's responsibility. The plane's co-pilot leaned back in his chair and stretched luxuriously. He loosened his safety belt and got up. He stepped carefully past the column between the right and left-hand pilot seats. That column contained a fraction of the innumerable dials and controls the pilots of the modern multi-engine plane had to watch and handle. The pilot went to the coffee pot and flipped a switch. Joe fidgeted again on his improvised seat. Again he wished that he could be riding in the back with the crates, but it would be silly to insist on perching somewhere in the freight compartment. There was a steady roaring in the cabin by the motors. Once the ears got accustomed to it, and by now the noise sounded as if it were being heard through the cushions. Presently, the coffee pot bubbled unheard. The co-pilot lighted a cigarette. Then he drew a paper cup of coffee, handed it to the pilot. The pilot seemed negligently to contemplate some dozens of dials, all of which were duly duplicated on the right-hand, co-pilot's side. The co-pilot glanced at Joe. "Coffee?" "Thanks," said Joe. He took a paper cup. The co-pilot said, "Everything okay with you?" "I'm all right," said Joe. He realized the co-pilot felt talkative. He explained, "Those crates I'm traveling with, The family's firm had been working on that machinery for months. It was finished, with the final grinding done practically with feather dusters. I can't help but worrying about it. There was 4 months of work in just lapping the shafts and balancing rotors. We made a telescoping mounting once for an observatory in South Africa, but compared to this gadget, we worked on that one blindfolded. "Pilot gyros, eh?" said the co-pilot. "That's what the waybill said. But if they were all right when they left the plant, they'll be all right when they are delivered." Joe said ruefully, "Still, I'd feel better riding back there with them." "Sabotage bad at the plant?" asked the co-pilot. "Tough." "Sabotage? No, why would there be sabotage?" demanded Joe. The co-pilot said mildly, "Not quite everybody is anxious to see the space platform take off." "Not everybody. What on earth do you think is the biggest problem out there where they're building it?" "I wouldn't know," admitted Joe. "Keeping the weight down? But there is a new rocket fuel that's supposed to be all right for sending the platform up. Wasn't that the worst problem? Getting a rocket fuel with enough power per pound?" The co-pilot sipped his coffee and made a face. It was too hot. "Fella," he said dryly, "that stuff was easy. The slide rule boys did that. The biggest job in making a new moon for Earth is keeping it from being blown up before it can get out to space. There are a few gentlemen who thrive on power politics. They know that once the space platform's floating serenely around the Earth, with a nice stock of atom-headed guided missiles on board, power politics is finished. So they're doing what they can to keep the world as if it's always been, equipped with just one moon and many armies. And they're doing plenty, if you ask me." "You haven't heard the half of it," said the co-pilot. "The air transport has lost nearly as many planes and more men on this particular airlift than it did in Korea. Well, that was the big job. I don't know how many other men have been killed, but there's a strictly local hot war going on out where you're headed. No holds barred, haven't you heard?" It sounded exaggerated. Joe said politely, "I heard there was cloak and dagger stuff going on." The pilot drained his cup and handed it to the co-pilot. He said, "He thinks you're kidding him." He turned back to the contemplation of the instruments before him and the view out the transparent plastic of the cabin windows. "He does?" the co-pilot said to Joe. "You've got the security checks around your plant. They weren't put there for fun. It's 100 times worse where the whole platform's being built." "Security?" said Joe. He shrugged. "We know everybody who's working at the plant. We've known them all their lives. They get mad if we started to get stuffy. We don't bother." "That I'd like to see," said the co-pilot skeptically. "No barbed wire around the plant? No identity badges you wear when you go in? No security officers screaming blue murder every 5 minutes? What do you think all that's for? You've built these pilot gyros. You had to have that security stuff." "But we didn't," insisted Joe. "Not any of it. The plant's been in the same village for 80 years. It started building wagons and plows, and now it turns out machine tools and precision machinery. It's the only factory around, and everybody who works there went to school with everyone else. and so did our fathers. We know one another." The co-pilot was unconvinced. "No kidding?" "No kidding," Joe assured him. In World War II, the only spy scare in the village was an FBI man who came around looking for spies. The village cop, who locked him up and wouldn't believe in his credentials. They had to send somebody from Washington to get him out of jail. The co-pilot grinned reluctantly. "I guess there are such places," he said enviously. "You should have built the platform. It's plenty different on this job. We can't even talk to a girl without security clearance for an interview beforehand. And we can't speak to strange men or go out alone after dark." The pilot grunted. The co-pilot's tone changed. "Not quite that bad," he admitted, "but it's bad. It's really bad. We lost 3 planes last week. I guess you call it an action against saboteurs. 1 flew to pieces in midair. Sabotage. Carrying critical stuff. 1 crashed on takeoff, carrying irreplaceable instruments. Somebody put a detonator in a servo motor. And 1 froze in its landing glide and flew smack dab into a landing field. They had to scrape it up. When this ship got a major overhaul 2 weeks ago, we flew it with our fingers crossed for 4 trips running. It seems to be all right, though. We gave it the works. But I won't look forward to a serene old age until the platform's out of the atmosphere. Not me." He went to put the pilot's empty cup in the disposal slot. The plane went on. There wasn't anything underneath but clouds, and there wasn't anything overhead but sky. The clouds were a long way down, and the sky was simply up. Joe looked down and saw a faint spot of racing brightness with a hint of colors around it. It was the sort of nimbus that substitute for a shadow when a plane is high enough above the clouds. It raced madly over the irregular upper surface of the cloud layer. The plane flew and flew. Nothing happened at all. This was 2 hours from the field, which it had taken off with the pilot gyro cases. As it was the last item of collected cargo, Joe remembered how grimly the 2 crew members had prevented anybody from even approaching it on the ground, except those who actually loaded the cases, and how one of the 2 had watched them every second. Joe fidgeted. He didn't quite know how to take the co-pilot's talk. The Kenmore Precision Tool Plant was owned by his family, but it wasn't so much a family as a civic enterprise. The young men of the village grew up to regard fanatically fine workmanship with the casual matter-of-factness everywhere reserved for plowing or deep-sea fishing. Joe's father owned it, and someday Joe might head it, but he couldn't hope to keep the respect of the men of the plant unless he could handle every tool on the place and split a thousandth at least 5 ways. 10 would be better. But as long as the feeling at the plant stayed as it was now, there'd never be a security problem there. If the co-pilot was telling the truth. Joe found a slow burning beginning inside him. He had a picture in his mind that was practically a dream. It was something big and bright, and ungainly, swimming silently in the emptiness with a field of stars behind it. The stars were a tiny pinpoint of light. They were unwinking and distinct because there was no air where this thing floated. The blackness between them was absolute, because this was space itself. The thing that floated was a moon, a man-made moon. It was an artificial satellite of Earth. Men were now building it. Presently, it would float as Joe dreamed of it. Where the sun struck it, it would be unbearably bright. And where there were shadows, they would be abysmally black, except perhaps when earthshine from the planet below would outline it in a ghostly fashion. There would be men in the thing that floated in space. It swam in a splendid orbit about the world that had built it. Sometimes there were small ships that, so Joe imagined, would fight their way up to it, panting great plumes of rocket smoke and bringing food and fuel to its crew. And presently, one of those panting small ships would refill its fuel tanks to the bursting point from the fuel other ships had brought. And yet the ship would have no weight, so it would drift away from the greater floating thing in space, and suddenly its rockets would spout flames and fumes, and would head triumphantly out away from Earth, and it would be the first vessel ever to strike out for the stars. That was the picture Joe had of the space platform and its meaning. Maybe it was romantic, but men were working right now to make that romance come true. This transport plane was flying to a small town, improbably called Bootstrap, carrying one of the most essential devices for the platform's equipment. In the desert near Bootstrap, there was a gigantic construction shed. Inside that shed, men were building exactly the monstrous object that Joe pictured to himself. They were trying to realize a dream men have dreamed for decades. The necessary space platform that would be the dock, the wharf, the starting point from which the first human space explorers could start for infinity. The idea that anybody could want to halt such an undertaking made Joe Kenmore burn. The co-pilot painstakingly crushed out his cigarette. The ship flew with more steadiness than a railroad car rolls on rails. There was the oddly cushioned sound from the motors. It was all very matter-of-fact. But Joe said angrily, "Look, is any of what you said, well, kidding?" "I wish it were, fella," said the co-pilot. "I can talk to you about it, but most of it's hushed up." "I tell you." "Why can't you talk to me?" demanded Joe suspiciously. "What makes it all right for you to talk to me?" "You've got passage on the ship. That means something." "Does it?" asked Joe. The pilot turned in his seat to glance at Joe. "Do you think we carry passengers regularly?" he asked mildly. "Why not?" The pilot and the co-pilot looked at each other. "Tell him," said the pilot. "About 5 months ago," said the co-pilot, "there was an army colonel wrangled a ride to Bootstrap on a cargo plane. The plane took off. It flew all right until 20 miles from Bootstrap. Then it stopped checking. It dove straight for the shed the platform's being built in. It was shot down. When it hit, there was an explosion." The co-pilot shrugged. "You won't believe me, maybe, but a week later they found the colonel's body back east. Somebody murdered him." Joe blinked. "It wasn't the colonel who rode as a passenger," said the co-pilot. "It was somebody else. 20 miles from Bootstrap. he'd shot the pilots and taken the controls. That's what they figured anyhow. He meant to dive into the construction shed, because very, very cleverly, they managed to get a bomb in the plane, disguised as cargo. They got the man who'd done that later, but it was rather late. Joe said dubiously, "But would one bomb destroy the shed and platform?" "This one would," said the co-pilot. "It was an atom bomb, but it wasn't a good one. It didn't detonate properly. It was a fizz-off." Joe saw the implications. Cranks and crackpots couldn't get a hold of the materials for atom bombs. It took the resources of a large nation for that. But a nation that didn't quite dare start an open war might try to sneak in one atom bomb to destroy the space station. Once the platform was launched, no other nation could dream of world domination. The United States wouldn't go to war if the platform was destroyed, but there could be a strictly local hot war. The pilot said sharply, "Something down below." The co-pilot barely leaped into the right-hand seat, his safety belt buckled in half a heartbeat. "Check," he said in a new tone. "Where?" The pilot pointed. "I saw something dark," he said briefly, "where there was a deep dent in the cloud." The co-pilot flew a switch. Within seconds, a new sound entered the cabin. Beep, 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 beep. There were thin squeaks, spaced a full half-second apart, that rose to an audibility in pitch in the fractions of a second they lasted. The co-pilot snatched a hand phone from the wall above his head and held it to his lips. "Flight 22 calling," he said crisply. "Something's got a radar on us. We saw it. Here, the floor of the cabin tilted markedly. Now we're climbing. Get a fix on us and come a-running. Over." He took the phone from his lips and said conversationally, "Radar's a giveaway. This is no flyaway. You wouldn't think he'd take that much of a chance, would you?" Joe clenched his hands. The pilot did things to the levers on the column between the two pilots. He said curtly, "Arm the JADOs." The co-pilot did something mysterious and said, "Check." All this took place in seconds. The pilot said, "I see something." And instantly there was swift, tense teamwork in action. A call by radio, asking for help. The plane headed up for greater clearance between it and the clouds. The JADOs made ready for firing. They were the jet-assisted takeoff rockets, which on short or rough field would double the motor's thrust for a matter of seconds. In a straightaway flight, they should make the plane leap ahead like a scared rabbit, but they wouldn't last long. "I don't like this," said the co-pilot in a flat voice. "I don't see what he could do." Then he stopped. Something zoomed out of the cloud. The action was completely improbable. The thing that appeared looked absolutely commonplace. It was a silver-winged private plane, the sort that cruises at 175 knots, and can hit nearly 250 if it pushed. It was expensive, but not large. It came straight up out of the cloud layer and went lazily on over its back and dived down into the cloud layer again. It looked like somebody stunting for his own private lunatic pleasure. The kind of crazy thing some people do, and for which there is no possible explanation. But there was an explanation for this. At the very top of the loop, threads of white smoke appeared. They should have been unnoticeable against the cloud. But for the fraction of an instant, they were silhouetted against the silver wings, and they were not misty whips of vapor. They were dense, sharply defined rocket trails. They shot upward, spreading out. They unreeled with incredible, ever-increasing velocity. The pilot hit something with the heel of his hand. There was a heart-stopping delay. Then the transport leapt forward with a force to stop one's breath. The JATOs were firing furiously, and the ship jumped. There was a bellowing that drowned out the sound of the engines. Joe was slammed back on the rear wall of the cabin. He struggled against the forces that pushed him tailward. He heard the pilot saying calmly, "That plane shot rockets at us. If they're guided, we're sunk." Then the threads of smoke became the thickness of cables, of columns. They should have ringed the transport plane in, but the JATOs had jumped it crazily forward, and they were still thrusting fiercely to make it go faster than any prop plane could. The acceleration made the muscles at the front of Joe's throat ache as he held his head upright against it. There'll be proximity. Then the plane bucked. Very probably at that moment, it was stretched far past the limit of strain, for which even its factor of safety was designed. Once the rocket had let go, the others went with it. The rockets had proximity fuses. If they had ringed the transport ship and gone off with it enclosed, it would now be a tumbling mass of wreckage. But the JATOs had thrown the plane out ahead of the target area. Suddenly, they cut off, and it seemed as if the ship had braked. But the pilot dived steeply for speed. The co-pilot was saying coldly into the microphone, "He shot rockets. Looked like an Army issue 3.5s with proximities. They missed, and were mighty lonely." The transport tore on, both pilots grimly watching the cloud bank below. They moved their bodies as they stared out the windows, so by no possibility could any part of the plane mask something they should see. As they searched, the co-pilot spoke evenly into the microphone at his lips. He wouldn't carry more than 4 rockets, and he's dumping his racks and firing equipment now, but he might have a friend with him. Better get here quick if you want to catch him. He'll be the innocent private pilot you ever saw in no time. Then the pilot grunted. Something was streaking across the cloud formation far, far ahead. 3 things. They were jet planes, and they seemed not so much to approach as to swell in size. They were coming at better than 500 knots, 10 miles a minute, and the transport was heading for them at its top speed of 300 knots. The transport and the flight of jets neared each other at the rate of a mile in less than 4 seconds. The co-pilot said crisply, "Silver Messner with red wingtips." The number began. He gave the letter and the first digits of the vanished plane's official designation, without which it could not take off from or be serviced at any flying field. Joe heard an instant, swift beep, 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 which would be the radars of the approaching jets. He could not hear any answers that might reach the co-pilot as he talked to unseen persons who would relay his words to the jet fighters. One of them peeled off and sank into the cloud layer. The others came on. They set up in great circles about the transport, crossing before it, above it, around it, which gave the effect of flying around an object not in motion at all. The pilot flew on, frowning. The co-pilot said, "Yes, sure, I'm listening." There was a pause. Then he said, "Check, thanks." He hung the instrument back where it belonged, above his head and behind him. He thoughtfully mopped his brow. He looked at Joe. "Maybe," he said mildly, "you believe me when I tell you there's sort of a hot war going on to keep the platform from taking off." The pilot grunted. "Here's the third jet coming up." It was true. The jet that had dived into the clouds came up out of the cloud formation with somehow an air of impassive satisfaction. "Did they spot the guy?" "Yeah," said the co-pilot. "He must have picked up my report. He didn't dump his radar. He stayed in the cloud bank. When the jet came for him, spotting him with his night fighter stuff, he tried to ram. Tried for a collision. So the jet gave him the works. Blew him apart. Couldn't make him land. Maybe they'll pick up some things from his wreckage." Joe wet his lips. "I saw what happened," he said. "He tried to smash us with rockets. Where'd he get them? How were they smuggled in?" The co-pilot shrugged. "Maybe smuggled in, maybe stolen. They could have been landed from a sub anywhere on a good many thousands of miles of coast. They could have been hauled anywhere in a station wagon. The plane was a private-type ship. Plenty of them flying around. It could have been bought easily enough. All they need would be a farm somewhere where it could land and they could strap on a rocket rack and put on a radar. And they need information, probably a good lead. This business. Only just so many people could know what was coming on this ship, and what course it was flying, and so on. Security will have to check back from that angle." A shadow fell sharply on the transport ship. A jet shot past from above it. It wagged its wings and changed course. "We've got to land and be checked for damage," said the co-pilot negligently. "These guys will circle us and lead the way, as if we needed it." Joe subsided. He still had in his mind the glamorous and infinitely alluring picture of the space platform, floating grandly in its orbit, with white-hot sunshine on it, and multitude of stars beyond. He had been completely absorbed in that aspect of the job that dealt with the method of construction and the technical details by which the platform could be made to work. Now he had a sidelight on the sort of thing that has to be done when anything important is achieved. Figuring out how a thing can be done is only part of the job. Overcoming the obstacles to apparently commonplace steps is 9/10 of the difficulty. It had seemed to him that the most dramatic aspect of building the space platform had been the achievement of a design that would work in space, that could be gotten up into space, and that could be lived in under circumstances never before experienced. Now he saw that getting the materials to the spot where they were needed called for nearly as much brains and effort. Screening out spies and destructionists, that would be an ever greater achievement. He began to feel a tremendous respect and solitude for the people who were doing ordinary jobs in the building of the platform, and he worried about his own share more than ever. Presently, the transport ship sank towards the clouds. It sped through them, stone blind from the mist, and then there was a small airfield below. The pilot and co-pilot began a pattern of ritualistic conversation. Pitot and wing heaters, asked the pilot. The co-pilot put his hands successively on two controls. Off. Spark advance. The co-pilot moved his hands. Take off and climb, said the co-pilot. Blowers, low. Fuel selectors. The co-pilot moved his hands again to the appropriate controls, verifying that they were as he reported. Main on, he said matter-of-factly, cross-feed off. The transport plane slanted down steeply for the landing field that had looked so small at first, but expanded remarkably as they drew near. Joe found himself frowning. He began to see how really big a job it was to get a space platform even ready for takeoff, for a journey that in theory should last forever. It was daunting to think that before a spaceship could be built, and powered, and equipped with machinery, there had to be such wildly irrelevant plans worked out as a proper check of controls for the piston engine ship that flew the parts to the job. The details were innumerable. But the job was still worth doing. Joe was glad he was going to have a share in it.